Welcome back on the road with I am Johnny King as we head towards Rugby World Cup 2023 in France. On our last journey, or the beginning of our Rugby World Cup journey, was 1987 when New Zealand and Australia hosted the first global event, an event that was mostly made up, well, almost entirely made up by nations of the International Rugby Football Board, the 7 minus South Africa, and 9 nations that were invited. 87 was the beginning of something. It would certainly not be the ending of it. And as the years would ensue post 1987, as it relates to All Blacks rugby, it was a special time. It was a significant time. It was a time marked by dominance and success, an unbeaten run where a team seemed to have found their sweet spot. And so post 87, there wasn't any downturn like it can be and like it has been after a side has hit the summit of a Rugby World Cup victory. There was no sense of cycling yet. No sense of pausing and having to begin again and work your way towards the next summit 4 years on. And so the All Blacks were really more than dominant, really. That was, in my own memory, in my own experience, few periods where it was as emphatic as it was through 88, 89 and 90. And part of the reason was because of those involved, which is no surprise, led by Wayne Buck Shelford, a man who had plenty of mana, who turned around and transformed how the All Blacks viewed the haka, gave it its cultural meaning, infused it, informed, taught the players about what it really meant and how it should be undertaken. And through his own experiences with the armed forces, I believe it was the Navy, he had not only the cultural heritage, but you could also say the vocational standing, which encouraged a strength of character that was evident in not only the way he played, his abrasive style on the field, his willingness to lead from the front, but the sense of gravitas that surrounded him. And sides, probably is not an exaggeration to say that they feared the man, and they knew that with Wayne Buck Shelford leading the team, again we talk about what happened in 87 and the punch that took out Hugh Richards. He was a man who wouldn't look to someone else to take on a duty that he could do himself. He didn't shirk. He was every bit the leader of the pack. And when the All Blacks began to began to wane in the strength of their performances, as sides like the Wallabies, like Australia, began to get closer and closer, so I do my best to keep my camera in a decent position, the selectors in their wisdom got nervous, or became nervous, and change started to take root. And eventually that would mean that Buck Shelford was dropped. One that I remember at the time, as a local, it didn't seem like such a big deal. In fact, because of the talent surrounding them, it could even have been viewed as reasonable. However, if you talk to the nations of the world, those who were his opponents, then that was exactly what they wanted. Buck was a nemesis on the field, and so I do my best to avoid a duck. Decided to perch himself in the middle of the road. Much like that duck, the opposition were in harm's way of oncoming traffic, and the oncoming traffic was Wayne Buck Shelford. And so when he moved on, or was moved on, with other factors that I'll get to in a minute, the shape of the global rugby structure was beginning to move and morph. The All Blacks, so dominant, now had cracks, and the cracks looked like they could be exposed to grow even larger. Part of that happened in quite eccentric ways, and a name that means a lot to another rugby team when it could have meant so much to an All Blacks unit. The name, Viliame Ofahengaway. Viliame Ofahengaway, the flanker for the Wallabies, should have been a flanker for the All Blacks, and most likely would have been, if not for a bit of trans-Tasman, or how shall we describe it? Political posturing, red tape, or I was going to say green tape, red tape that was suitable for those across our coastline or off our coastline. Well, we can decide, maybe depending on how we want to paint the picture. Viliame Ofahengaway, excuse me, was picked for the New Zealand Colts and made his way to Australia as part of the team. However, because of some paperwork, was able to get into the country, but basically wasn't able to leave. And so, a quandary. What would you do? Well, maybe today's world, then such would be the outcry and the response, then maybe official parties would get involved and put the pressure on, put the heat on from this side of the Tasman. But that didn't happen. Well, if it did happen, it didn't do much. So Viliame Ofahengaway was stuck in Australia, but he wouldn't be alone for long, as support structures in that part of the world obviously understood the potential gift that we were giving. And so he was brought into the locale and eventually would be selected for the Wallabies on the flank. And he was a lightning rod. I think that's probably a good way of phrasing it, for the changing world of rugby at our time. And he certainly made an impact, combined with the change of Wayne Buck Shelford. Then Viliame Ofahengaway, or Willie O as he was called, provided the Wallabies with a physical edge. And when that was factored in with other names like a surging Tim Horan, and those that were more experienced, that had class, like a David Liner, or a Michael Liner, sorry. David Liner. That's a David Campese I was going to say. David Campese and Michael Liner. You engage those type of names, and others as well, like a Nick Farr-Jones. There was experience in the Wallaby forward pack as well. They just needed a pointy edge, and that pointy edge was a Tongan enforcer, Willie O. And so as we head towards the Rugby World Cup in 1991, the worm just started to turn. The All Blacks lost some players through their own decision making, but also Rugby League had an impact here. John Gallagher, I remember the impact of John Gallagher, not only in our team in 1987, but also the struggle it was to try and replace him when he decided to cross codes and to take on the challenge and to pass on his exploits into the league code. And league code probably didn't really suit him as much as rugby union. However, that would impact. I know as we headed into the Rugby World Cup in 91 for the All Blacks, trying to find a replacement, Terry Wright, Kieran Crowley, there wasn't really a suitable replacement, and even other names were offered. I left a big hole when our custodian decided to make a different decision and move on. And so, as the All Blacks struggled to hold on, I remember the test in the Blazers. I was doing my best to get rid of what's in my mouth. I know, pleasant. I remember the test at the Blazers. I'm pretty sure it would have been 91, because the Rugby World Cup, unlike the Rugby World Cup in Australia and New Zealand, which was in May, June, was in October, November, which would be sort of the general spot where it has been celebrated more of the time. And I remember the test at Eden Park and it being really, really tight, and the details aren't so much as significant as the sort of the trajectory, or the direction of where these two sides were heading. The Wallabies were heading up. The All Blacks were heading down. They weren't just plateauing. They probably had plateaued, and now there was a descent. And I guess the question is, could this Wallaby side, would their rise be enough, and would the All Blacks descent be enough where they'd effectively cross, maybe in the night of the space between those test matches and the 91 Rugby World Cup? Well, if you know what transpired, you already know the answer. But we'll save the details for the future in this video. Not too distant future. So what of the event? Well, in the first Rugby World Cup, basically everyone was invited. It was easy if you're part of the International Rugby Football Board. However, if you weren't, then obviously there were some other measures or machinations that were informing or encouraging. For 91, the second event, obviously some things were in place, and so the 8 quarter-finalists had direct entry into Rugby World Cup 1991. And the other 8 teams, well, they wouldn't be invited, but they would go through the type of, I guess you could say, tournament play over a period of time to decide who would make it. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 more teams. There were 33 who wanted to be part of Rugby World Cup 1991, as my phone decides to really take it out on me and sidestep my visuals. So 33 nations, 8 made it. It just so happened, and unsurprisingly maybe because of how experience impacts, 7 of the 8 nations who made Rugby World Cup 1987 made Rugby World Cup 1991. There was a change. 1 nation missed out and 1 nation made it. Now, if you've looked at that video, and I encourage you to look at it before this one, I did point out that there was a surprise when Western Samoa, no, Western Samoa is not really different from Manu Samoa except in name. It was Western Samoa at that stage were left out for Tonga. Well, when given the opportunity to prove their merit on the field of play, Western Samoa would make it. And so Western Samoa made the 1991 Rugby World Cup and Tonga missed out. That's not an insignificant detail from my own perspective as well, because probably the most memorable factor of Rugby World Cup 1991 was Western Samoa and the impact they would provide on a world stage and a personal stage as well. I was in my middle teens, living in Christchurch, and was taken in, was, you could say, somewhat captivated by this Western Samoa team and side that had many names that were familiar to rugby watchers in New Zealand because of the close connection. So many New Zealand born players, and some who would cross over. The one that enters my mind very quickly is Frank Bunce. So they made it. So what of the tournament? What is the recollection that stands out? Well, I've already really indicated, and it surrounds Western Samoa, but we'll get to them shortly. First match up. Remembering that the opening match at Twickenham between the All Blacks and England, we were nervous about the All Blacks in New Zealand. We weren't confident that they were going to win it like we had been. There was that assurance. And when you move from just an absolute assurance that your side was going to win to questioning whether or not they would follow through, there was genuine doubt and maybe even a touch of under the cover skepticism that they could actually win it. Almost a sense of knowing that it's almost like you try to ignore the obvious. It was clear that they weren't where they had been and where they needed to be, but it was where they were. And in that historical context, where they happened to be on that first match versus England, and you wondered, well, thankfully the All Blacks would win, and that did quell some consternation, we could say, maybe some doubt. Michael Jones and John Kerwin involved, one sort of signature move between the two, and it'll be enough to get the All Blacks home. The other matches that involve the other nations don't really stand out in my memory. I mentioned previously the 91 and 99 Rugby World Cups. They don't stand as much to attention, and that's partly because of what transpired for my nation, partly because of probably the distance, although 95 stands out and has a lot of resonance and a lot of details surrounding that. And so there are more than one factor and multiple factors, and yet there are still some pretty significant moments. I remember the All Black contests where they won, but it was just average. It was a sense of averageness, if I can use that, about this All Blacks unit, and a knowledge that what mattered in this tournament was still to come. The one contest that really stands out for me, and if I think of the 91 Rugby World Cup, I will remember it and celebrate it because of the rise of Western Samoa. Not only because of the close connection with Aotearoa, but also because of how they played and what happened when they took on Wales at the Cardiff Arms Park. The contest took place on a school morning in New Zealand. It was captivating, and it was a little bit shocking in terms of our experience, remembering the International Rugby Football Board and the fact that you played nations generally who are part or members of the International Rugby Football Board. And so my experience had been very much, as I mentioned in the previous video, and so when these other nations came on, they provided that there was a dramatic point of entry into my rugby conceptualizations, and the fact that there was a relationship there. There was a close connection. You felt a kinship with Western Samoa. And as the match at the Arms Park began to take shape, then Western Samoa, I keep wanting to say Manu Samoa because we've said it for so long now, but Western Samoa showed that they could be in with a proverbial grin, and they started and continued pretty strong as I wait for the traffic on this road. And as it got closer to school starting, and as the match got closer to the 80, there was only going to be one winner in my world. Fortunate that I was, that my dad was a lover of rugby, and just to give you a bit of an indication, when we were in New Plymouth, it was one of the touring, it might have been the Queensland Reds. They came to the Naki and played in New Plymouth, and Dad wrote a letter, or may have been Mum on Dad's behalf, wrote a letter to the school he took me out of school for the afternoon. I believe it was when Dave Loveridge injured his knee. I could be wrong there, but that's just off the top. So our family had formed, and it was clear that we weren't going to school until the test match finished. And Manu, there we go, Western Samoa pulled out the surprise, the wonderfully shocking victory. It put rugby on a different type of footing, on a different type of mat. It created a different map. You could say it was probably the first match in a Rugby World Cup orbit that said, you may not be the strongest team in terms of your history, you may not have a status in the game, however, in this tournament, Japan can beat South Africa. That was the type of result, and it was so beautifully shocking and wonderful to watch. And they would be the darlings of the 91 tournament. In the quarterfinals, I probably remember two matches really quite well in the quarterfinals, and I remember them for different reasons. Of course, the All Blacks, they were playing Canada. Remember the weather conditions, a lot of rain, and a pretty unconvincing performance from the All Blacks. Yes, they won, and you'd say the scoreboard was dominant enough. However, it was again a continuation of what had been, and on the horizon you expected it to be one other side. However, when Ireland hosted at Lansdowne Road, again different stadia back in those days, Cardiff Arms to Millennium, and of course Lansdowne Road to the ground. I'm trying to remember the name of the Irish one now, which has slipped my memory, and of the sponsor involved with it, and new grounds on old surroundings, or on old foundations, you could say. And it seemed like the unthinkable was going to happen. Maybe the All Blacks would have a get out of jail card and they would be able to pull it out, nab the victory, not by beating the Wallabies, but by playing Ireland, who at that point in time Ireland hadn't beaten the All Blacks. Of course, that's been quite a recent reality in the code. And so when Ireland were surprisingly in front, and they showing a redoubtable resistance, then with minutes left, maybe Ireland could pull it out. Maybe they were going to win. They were up 18-15, I believe, with minutes left, and they just needed to be able to close the door. They just needed to be able to finish the opposition off, control possession, not make mistakes, and it could be theirs. However, such as the champion side that the Wallabies would become, they were able to score in the final moment. So I remember thinking, even through that final play, because if my memory serves me right, they had a penalty, which I think could have drawn the match, or they had position. Maybe I'm thinking of a drop kick as I look to turn without sending the camera into its recent gyrations. And so instead of taking the safe option, they showed self-belief, they showed confidence, they showed assurance, and they showed a clinical ability to finish, an intentionality that would mean they would score a winning try and they would win their quarterfinal, setting up a week later a contest with my nation, with New Zealand, with the All Blacks. In fact, if I think about what would transpire moving forward, there's probably, you can even say another match actually stands out for a singular moment, but we'll get to that. Semi-finalists would be England-Scotland at Murrayfield, and New Zealand-Australia again at Lansdowne Road. And those matches, I remember, the England-Scotland has a really poignant moment for me, because I think it was an opportunity for the Scots to do something that they haven't done since, and I don't know, maybe they'll be able to bring it together as a smaller nation in the rugby world. One of the ones, a historic nation, but still one that struggles more with nations who have maybe a bigger and a larger player population. There was a semi-final versus England, and I remember when Gavin Hastings, the doyen of the Scottish team, the statesman of Scottish rugby, missed a penalty pretty much out in front. England would win the semi-final 9-6, and I remember thinking that that's going to be something that he'll remember. And as the future would have it, I think another significant player in my rugby orbit has a moment himself. You know, rugby career is much more than those individual happenings, but yet when you consider what it could have been and what it could have provided, Scotland was so close, and yet because of that result they would be so far. The other semi-final, of course, involves the All Blacks and the Wallabies, and what had been, or what had been perceived even, was now a reality. The Wallaby side would come out, and they would come out like they were hot, and we were not. And at half time it was pretty much over. It's interesting because when you look at the scoreboard in light of the recent reality of rugby, you think, well, that's actually not as bad as what it looked like. But at that time, given what transpired, it seemed pretty vast. One moment sort of sticks in my memory bank when the All Blacks were on attack. They had been for the first time in the first half, right near the half time, and they had a line out and they weren't able to finish, and it sort of seemed like that was the way it was going to be, and the Wallabies would hold on and the All Blacks were out of the Rugby World Cup. Well, you've got the third and the fourth playoff match, which they would win, as you probably expect. The All Blacks have done okay in those matches over their past. However, the reason they came to Rugby World Cup 91 was not to get third, it was to take home the trophy. It was to defend their title, and they would not be doing that this time. So the final at Twickenham between England and Australia, and of course we know what happened in 03. But in 91, playing at home was an opportunity, and it would be pretty close, but yet the Wallabies would be able to hold on and would be good for the victory. They were crowned Rugby World Cup champions, world champions in modern parlance, in the year of 1991, and would go on from there. That was a beginning point really for them, in a period of strength, of player depth, and in the amateur era where I guess they probably flourished, and it suited the nature of their sporting makeup in Australia, where there are a lot of competing interests. And so if the other nations of the rugby world are amateur, then the advantage that the other nations can have if they go professional is taken away, and therefore the Wallabies can potentially make the most of their own benefits in an amateur era. And so the Wallabies, Rugby World Cup champions in 1991. The rugby world had its second event, and it had been another success. More nations had been involved, and this would only continue into what would transpire. Maybe 91 is the next step from 87, but it would be an important step. It was held by the other nations of the International Rugby Football Board, the other nations in the north, and so it was shared out. And the one nation who was not part of either 87 or 91 because of the tragedy that had been apartheid, would undergo transformation in the years following 91 and are a big part of what transpires into 1995. A Rugby World Cup that signalled the dawn of not only a game that was increasingly exposed to a world audience, but of one player who would capture the attention and would become rugby's probably first truly global superstar. We'll get to that in the next video. But the rugby world was going to continue to grow and continue to develop. 91 was in the books. This has been our rugby story so far. I trust you've enjoyed this personal recollection through my own lens, in light of obvious historical context out of an All Blacks and New Zealand Rugby Worldview context. But I trust it has provided some insight into the story so far of rugby union through the arrival of the Rugby World Cup, which would grow and would become even more significant in the next event. I encourage you, if you've liked and enjoyed even a little bit this video and you've stayed to the end, to like, comment and to share it, because that is the way, an effective way of being able to not only spread this story through the Rugby World Cup as we lead into 2023, but also encourage greater engagement with others who may be able to offer their own insight. And if you can, if you're around in 91, I realise many will not have any personal experience of what transpired and can only go on what's been told to them or maybe what's been viewed. But if you have some experiences, I'd love to read it, and I'm sure others would appreciate your own personal experiences. And if you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe. Now, this is going to be a very dated comment coming up, but up until Friday the 27th of October, 12 PM New Zealand time, we're running a competition on I Am Johnny King on the channel, and there's a specific video that relates to that. So if you do subscribe and you do leave a comment on that piece or that post, then you'll be in to win a rugby jersey of your choice. So if you subscribe and leave a comment affirming that type of reality, then you signal that you're in to win. And so if you watch this before that period, I would encourage you to make the most of that opportunity. As I look in front of me and I see a bit of a fire taking place, it looks like a business burning up some remnants of rubbish and therefore things that they don't want anymore. On that note, I'm going to make this turn off here and decelerate so we can take it, because it is rather sharp. And I'll thank you for watching, and look forward to further and future engagements on this channel. Another reason why you should subscribe is because of all that is going to take place over the coming weeks, months, and hopefully years as this just continues to grow. We've cycled through, going back there. We tentatively called this Latour. The story so far that has been Rugby World Cup. That was 1991. 1995 is just around the corner. And in the next video in this series, I'll be talking the Rugby World Cup as it headed to the Republic, to the Rainbow Nation, as a platform and a viewing stage only became larger, brighter and better. Thank you for watching.